Chapter 7. Patriot. War has many faces, or rather, in war, men and nations wear many faces. Eric Severide. 1. In Locksley Hall, the poem by Tennyson that young Harry Truman had copied down in his last year in high school, and that he carried still, neatly folded in his wallet, were lines describing an aerial war of the future, lines written well before the invention of the airplane. Heard the heavens fill with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew from the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue. In July of 1940 began the first great air battle in history, the Battle of Britain, as day after day Hitler's Luftwaffe crossed the Channel to bomb British ports, airfields, and London, and the Spitfires and Hurricanes of the Royal Air Force went up to grapple and defense. It was all Tennyson had foreseen and worse. In a raid on London, September 7th, there were 375 German bombers, an unprecedented force. Then the night raids began, and devastation from incendiary bombs that Americans read about in dispatches by correspondents Robert Bunnell and Helen Kirkpatrick, or heard described firsthand by the dramatic radio voice of Edward R. Murrow. As I watched those white fires flame up and die down, watched the yellow blazes grow dull and disappear, said Murrow in his broadcast of October 10th at 5 a.m. London time, I thought, what a puny effort is this to burn a great city. Hitler boasted that his air blitz would break the will of the English people. On Sunday, December 29th, London was subjected to the most savage bombing yet. More than 1,000 fires raged across the city. In Washington that same night, Franklin Roosevelt was wheeled into the oval-shaped diplomatic reception room on the ground floor of the White House to deliver by radio the fireside chat, to be known as his Arsenal of Democracy speech. The Nazis, he said, were determined to enslave the world, and he warned that stroking a tiger would never make it a kitten. He saw American civilization in graver peril than at any time since Plymouth and Jamestown. It was not war he wanted, but all-out massive production for war to supply those nations under Nazi attack. We must become the great arsenal of democracy, for this is an emergency as serious as war itself. On January 6, 1941, at a joint session of the new Congress, Senator Harry Truman listened as Roosevelt delivered a second ringing summons to action in support of those nations fighting in defense of what he called the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. To Truman it was the president at his best. A few days later came Roosevelt's plan for Lend-Lease, to send Britain arms on credit, and in both houses of Congress the fight was on. Isolationists in the Senate, Wheeler, Vandenberg, Bennett Clark, Gerald P. Nye, Taft of Ohio, objected bitterly, calling the bill the road to war. Wheeler, Truman's old mentor, was the most scathing of all, saying it would plow under every fourth American boy, which Roosevelt called the rottenest thing that had been said in public life in his generation. Wheeler, Clark, and the others could not have been more wrong or short-sighted, Truman felt. Bennett Clark had made himself a favorite of the America First movement, praised Lindbergh, and claimed, "We have everything to lose and nothing to gain in a war." Clark opposed aid to Britain, opposed further involvement of any kind by the United States. If Hitler conquered Europe, he said, we're better off defending the United States than frittering away our supplies in Europe. Clark was destroying himself politically, Truman was certain, and plainly Clark was having increasing difficulty staying sober. Repeatedly, Truman voted against amendments designed to restrict Roosevelt's execution of the bill. Truman was by now a member of both the Military Affairs Committee and the Military Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. In September, he had voted for the first peacetime draft. By December, more than $10 billion had been awarded in defense contracts in a country that was officially still at peace. Testifying on the Hill, the Army's Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, had called for a force of 2 million men and another $1 billion to cover expenses, and said the money was only a start. Questioned whether he was not asking for more than necessary to meet the emergency, he replied, "My relief of mind would be tremendous if we had just too much of something besides patriotism and spirit." Senator Truman, who was by now a colonel in the reserves, and who knew how critical was the shortage of qualified officers, went to Marshall's office in the rabbit warren of the old munitions building and tried to enlist. Pulling his reading glasses down on his nose, Marshall told him he was too old and could better serve his country in the Senate. Events were moving rapidly. An older, simpler way of life in Washington was passing. It was becoming a different city overnight. All through the Depression years, even with the changes imposed by the New Deal since 1933, it had remained a small town in most ways, Southern at heart and unhurried. Now there were new people everywhere, swarms of new federal employees, more automobiles, more rush and confusion. The year before, it appeared the old temporaries on the mall, acres of unsightly structures like the munitions building put up during the First World War, as it was now being called, might at last be torn down and taken away. Instead, the demand was to increase their number. A hodgepodge of new war agencies was sprouting, with names and initials difficult to keep straight. The NDMB, National Defense Mediation Board, the OPM, Office of Production Management, and later the OEM, Office of Emergency Management. There was the SPAB, Supplies, Priorities and Allocations Board, and the DPC, Defense Plants Corporation. Every month was adding 5,000 people to the city's population. Already the shortage of housing was more acute than in 1918. The Trumans were extremely lucky to find a new apartment, 5 small rooms at 4701 Connecticut Avenue, on the street side of the building, second floor, for $120 a month. And this time they would hold on to it. Bess, the madam, or the boss as the senator referred to her, having decided she and Margaret would stay through the year. There were lines at movie theaters, constant crowds at Union Station. Hotel bars and the best restaurants were a hubbub of manufacturers' agents in search of defense contracts and influence peddlers claiming to have an inside track. The talk was different, more urgent, and full of new expressions like stockpile, tooling up, and mobilize. The New Deal was passé now, the Depression a bygone era. The hero of the hour, so different from the kind who had flocked to Washington in the early Roosevelt years, was the $1-a-year man, a high-powered, high-priced corporation executive who had taken a government post but kept his old corporate salary, an innovation that some, like Senator Truman, looked on with great skepticism. Yet as fast as the pace was picking up, it was hardly enough, given the urgency of the crisis. To those like General Marshall, who knew the truth of the country's military strength and were trying desperately to do something about it, the overriding worry was how slowly change was taking place. In the beginning, Truman had little idea what he was getting into. Concerned about complaints from constituents of gross extravagance and profiteering in the construction of Fort Leonard Wood, a new camp for draftees in south-central Missouri, concerned also that his home state was not getting its share of defense contracts, he decided on a little investigation of his own. Setting off from Washington in the old Dodge, he drove south as far as Florida, then on into the Midwest, eventually swinging north to Michigan, stopping at Army installations and defense plants all along the way. It was another of his automobile odysseys, like the courthouse survey of earlier years, and he later claimed to have rolled up 30,000 miles, or 5,000 miles more than the distance around the world, which was preposterous. Still, he probably covered 10,000 miles, and the experience was an eye-opener, as he said. Hard times were plainly in retreat in the biggest boom in the history of the country. But great haste in the build-up for war was making unconscionably great waste. It was the same everywhere, he found. Millions of dollars were being squandered. Had there been such mismanagement of federal help for the poor and unemployed a few years earlier, he thought, the outcry would have been overwhelming. As it was, no one seemed to care or to be saying anything. If national defense was the issue, the sky was the limit. At Fort Leonard Wood, he found costly equipment and material lying about in the snow and rain, getting ruined, things that could never be used, would never be used. The contractor had had no previous construction experience. And there were men, hundreds of men, just standing around collecting their pay, doing nothing. Truman walked about this and other sites taking notes on what he saw and whatever people were willing to tell him. Unless asked, he seldom said who he was. Much camp construction, he discovered, was being done on a cost-plus basis. The contractor was paid for all costs, plus a fixed percentage profit, which could be virtually an open ticket for piling up excessive profits. He was disturbed, too, by the obvious fact that the vast part of defense work was going to a small number of large corporations, and these mainly in the East. He feared that many of the safeguards usually observed in government transactions were being thrown aside. He felt the president should be informed at once. Returning to Washington, he called the White House for an appointment, and from the moment he was ushered into the Oval Office, his reception could not have been more cordial or more gratifying personally. Roosevelt was in grand form. He gave the senator a hearty welcome from his chair, flinging one arm in the air in characteristic gesture. He called him Harry repeatedly, as for half an hour they talked across the clutter of papers and knickknacks covering the big mahogany desk. Yet, when the session ended, Truman came away wondering if he had made any impression at all. As he wrote to a friend, Roosevelt was so courteous and cordial it was hard to know just what he thought or where one stood with him. Anyway, he concluded, I'm going to lay it before the Senate. He spent weeks preparing a speech, consulting other senators, asking for suggestions from friends and staff. He told William Helm he was outraged over the greed of big business at such a time and of some of the labor unions. There's too much that is wrong here, he insisted. On Monday, February 10, 1941, Truman stepped into the well of the Senate to describe the problem as he saw it and to propose the establishment of a special committee to look into the awarding of defense contracts. It was his own idea, his own moment. His obscurity in national life and in the course of the war was about to end, and it was of his own doing. Reaction in the Senate was immediately favorable. Besides sounding an alarm on the scandalous state of military spending, he struck a responsive chord everywhere on the Hill by calling it grossly unfair for the War Department to ignore the suggestions of members of Congress concerning defense contracts. It is a considerable sin, he said, for a United States senator from a state to make a recommendation for contractors, although he may be more familiar with the efficiency and ability of our contractors than is anybody in the War Department. Referred first to the Committee on Military Affairs, Resolution 71 was reported out unanimously in a matter of days. But then back it went to the Committee to Audit and Control the Contingent Expenses of the Senate. There it might have languished indefinitely, for the committee's chairman was Jimmy Burns of South Carolina, who was close to the administration, and the administration had no wish to see its method of handling things scrutinized or stalled by any congressional committee. Roosevelt's continuing admonition to everyone involved with defense production was speed, speed, speed. To bring some semblance of order to operations, Roosevelt had established a National Defense Advisory Commission, then an Office of Production Management, but there was really no clear-cut administrative system or any one person in charge. In effect, the sprawling defense effort was being handled by the White House, where the last thing anyone wanted was a pack of congressional investigators to contend with. There was alarm, too, at the War Department. A single nettlesome senator could mean unending problems and bad publicity, let alone an ambitious chairman of an investigating committee whose main underlying intent, more than likely, would be to advance his political fortunes. Constant congressional probing could well delay or deter the whole program. Only one voice cautioned against a resentful attitude, Chief of Staff Marshall, who said it must be assumed that members of Congress are just as patriotic as we. Truman understood the potential peril in what he was proposing. From his reading of Civil War history, he knew what damage could be done to a president by congressional harassment in a time of emergency, and the lives it could cost by prolonging the war. Abraham Lincoln had been subjected to unrelenting scrutiny by the powerful Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which caused continuing trouble and delays. Its radical Republican leadership had insisted even on a say in the choice of field commanders and battle strategy, and as often as not it was the Confederates who benefited. Robert E. Lee once remarked that the committee was worth 2 divisions to him, an observation Truman would often cite. He had gone to the Library of Congress for the Civil War records to verify for himself what mistakes the committee had made. Like others, Truman had little use for investigations after the fact, such as those conducted by Senator Gerald P. Nye and his committee, who in examining the causes of the First World War had raised a conspiratorial theory of the role played by the munitions makers. The Nye Committee, Truman felt, had been a major cause of isolationist sentiment in the Congress and contributed more than anything else to the nation's woeful unpreparedness. It did no good, Truman said, to go digging up dead horses once a war was over. The thing to do is to dig this stuff up now and correct it. But what saved his proposal was another one put forward in the House by a belligerent Georgia Democrat, Eugene Cox, who openly despised Roosevelt and wanted the establishment of a joint congressional committee to investigate all activities involving national defense. At a White House meeting, Jimmy Burns stressed to the president how much better off he would be in friendly hands with the Truman Committee, and Roosevelt agreed. Burns also wanted Truman to be given an absurdly modest funding of $10,000, a shoestring, to keep watch on expenditures that in 1941 alone would exceed $13 billion. Though Truman objected vigorously, He managed only to get the appropriation raised to $15,000. Resolution 71 was reported out on a Saturday afternoon in March when a total of 16 senators were on the floor, none of whom objected as Burns asked for immediate adoption. The vote was unanimous. A week later, in a late-night session, after beating back isolationist amendments, the Senate passed the Lend-Lease bill, which called for the spending of another $7 billion. Its formal title was the Senate Special Committee to Investigate the National Defense Program, but from the start it was spoken of almost exclusively as the Truman Committee. There were 7 members, 5 Democrats, 2 Republicans. Except for Tom Connally of Texas, all, like the chairman, were junior senators and, in the words of one observer, distinguished only by their unspectacular competence. The Democrats included Connally, Carl Hatch of New Mexico, Monrad C. Walgren of Washington, and James Meade of New York. The Republicans were Joseph H. Ball of Minnesota and Owen Brewster of Maine. "Looks like I'll get something done," Harry wrote to Bess. The summer before, in the midst of the primary, he had told her, "The political situation is going to be something to write history about next year, and if I do win, watch out." He felt himself a participant in history again, as he had not since France. This second term in the Senate would be nothing like the first, he knew. Washington and the world were no longer the same. He was no longer the same. His proposal, as even his critics acknowledged, was a masterstroke. He had set himself a task fraught with risk, since inevitably it would lead to conflict with some of the most powerful, willful people in the capital, including the president. But again, as in France, as so often in his life, the great thing was to prove equal to the task. From his railway investigations, he had learned the importance of a committee staff. Now, on the advice of Attorney General Robert Jackson, he hired a young Justice Department lawyer named Hugh Fulton, who had just convicted a federal judge for fraud. Fulton was only 35 years old and memorable, a big, apple-cheeked figure, over 6 feet tall and rotund, who wore a black derby and spoke with a piping voice. He told the senator he wanted a salary of $9,000, or more than half the whole appropriation. Truman hired him, confident that if they produced results, money would be no problem. Like Truman, Fulton was an early riser and a steady worker. He was bright, tenacious, and as time proved, a superb choice. For several months he would be all the committee could afford in a paid staff, though the problem was temporarily circumvented with the old senatorial device of borrowing help from some of the downtown executive agencies. The first investigator hired was young Matthew J. Connally from Boston, who had worked for a Senate committee investigating campaign expenses. Others included George Meader, who would later become a member of Congress, Harold Robinson, a former FBI agent, Agnes Strauss-Wolff, the one woman in the group, Morris Lasker, a recent graduate of the Yale Law School, William Boyle, a young man from Kansas City who had worked his way up in the Pendergast organization from precinct captain to acting director of the Kansas City Police, and the ever-faithful Fred Canfill, who operated out of Truman's office in the Federal Building in Kansas City. The only major change on Truman's senatorial staff was the departure of Vic Messel under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Apparently, for all his devotion to the senator, Messel had been dipping into campaign funds for his own purposes, or Truman thought so, and he was told to find work elsewhere. As a replacement for Messel, Truman brought his jovial friend Harry Vaughn to Washington and made him both his secretary, as the position of administrative assistant was still called, and a liaison for the committee with the military services, Vaughn being a lieutenant colonel in the reserves. Later, Vaughn would leave to go on active duty with the Army Air Corps. There was to be no whitewash or witch hunt, Truman told his committee staff, no grandstanding for headlines or any attempt ever to forestall the defense effort. But neither were they to be cowed by rank or political pressure. The primary task was to get the facts. "There is no substitute for facts," he would say. "They must know what they were about. Give the work all you've got," he urged, warning them never to tell those under investigation they were doing a good job. "If you do, and it is later found they haven't done a good job, then they can say our committee agreed with what they did." Their time was to be spent only where there were clear and present problems. They were not to go looking for trouble where none was known, and this applied to staff investigators and committee members alike. Once in a closed or executive session, a senator not on the committee, Alexander Wiley of Wisconsin, who was sitting in, asked out of curiosity, "What are you fishing for this morning?" It seemed a fair question, he thought, in an executive session. Truman was offended. "This committee does not go on fishing expeditions," he answered. "I think the distinguished chairman resented my question," Wiley observed. "I do not like it," Truman said. "I resent it. We are not on a fishing expedition." All findings were to be reported as the work of the full committee, not of any one senator or of the chairman. The committee would have no say on military strategy, military personnel, or the size or disposal of the defense effort. What Truman came to appreciate most in Hugh Fulton was his honesty of purpose, and Fulton's contribution overall was to be of such obvious value that some observers would later speak of him as the driving force of the committee. But this was not the case. The driving force was Senator Truman. The long process began on April 15, 1941, with the appearance before the committee of a dozen highest-ranking officials, military and civilian, including the elderly Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and Chief of Staff Marshall. When the problem of seniority in the Army was discussed, Marshall insisted on the need for selective promotion. "You give a good leader very little, and he will succeed," he said, looking at the chairman. "You give a mediocrity a great deal, and he will fail." Years later, Truman would say that his respect for George Marshall had its beginning at this first session of the committee hearings. On April 23rd, the committee went to nearby Camp Meade in Maryland, the first of 9 camps on a cross-country inspection tour. One camp at Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, was found to have cost more than 10 times the original estimate. Another, Camp Wallace in Texas, which was supposed to have been built for $480,000, wound up costing $2,539,000. In several instances, the Army had shown fantastically poor judgment in selecting campsites. Fort Meade was a prime example, and an estimated $13 million had been wasted just by renting trucks and other construction equipment instead of buying it all outright at the start. The Army had made a special study of camp construction following the last war, when rampant waste and inefficiency had also prevailed, but as the committee discovered, this special study had been lost, news that left the chairman utterly astounded. If plans for the country's military campaigns were comparable to those for construction, Truman reported to the Senate, the situation was truly deplorable. The central problem was the system of cost-plus contracts. There was no attempt to ask contractors what they had been in the habit of making in peacetime, or even what they were willing to take, Truman would write. Huge fixed fees were offered by the government in much the same way that Santa Claus passes out gifts at a church Christmas party. Some contractors were making in a few months 3 to 4 times what they normally cleared in a year, and at no risk. One architect-engineer was found to have increased his income through an Army contract by 1,000%. Lieutenant General Brian B. Somervell, the hot-tempered Chief of Services of Supply, who was known for his efficiency, complained loudly about the committee as a creature formed in iniquity for political purposes. It was axiomatic, he said, that time and money could not be saved at the same time. General Somervell was a very brilliant general, remembered Matt Connolly, the chief investigator, but he was also a martinet, and he resented any intrusion or stepping on his toes. But that did not impress Senator Truman. He went ahead anyway. Later, Somervell would concede that in fact the Truman Committee's investigations of Army camp building alone had saved the government $250 million. Further, as the committee had strongly recommended, the responsibility for camp construction was taken away from the Quartermaster Corps and given to the Corps of Engineers, as it should have been in the first place. The senators on the committee worked extremely hard, almost without exception, and the chairman hardest of all. A few nights before the first interviews with Stimson and Marshall in April, Truman had what was diagnosed as a gallbladder attack. He had been wrenched from his sleep by such excruciating pains that Bess thought he must be having a heart attack. But there was no easing up on his schedule, and by June he was again badly exhausted. "My standing in the Senate and down the street," at the White House, "gets better and better," he wrote on June 19, 1941, in a letter to Bess, who was back in Missouri once more. "Hope I make no mistakes." If he weren't working so hard from daylight until dark, he didn't know what he would do without her, he said, adding plaintively, "Hope I won't be long here alone." On June 22nd came the stunning news that Hitler had turned and attacked Russia along an 1,800-mile front. Asked what he thought of this colossal turn of events, Truman spoke his mind in a way no one could fail to understand, and that would not be soon forgotten. "If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia," he said. "And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and that way let them kill as many as possible, although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances." It was hardly an appropriate observation at this juncture, but like many Americans and many in Congress, Truman saw little difference between the totalitarianism of fascist Germany and communist Russia, and particularly since the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 and Russia's invasion of tiny Finland. Nor was he willing to close his eyes to the realities of the Soviet regime just because suddenly it was Russia under Nazi assault. Stalin was only getting what he had coming to him, was the feeling, and one shared by a very large segment of the American people. Worried about the world, worried about himself, he went to the Bethesda Naval Hospital for a checkup, only to be told there was nothing the matter with him beyond fatigue. He was suffering from severe headaches and nausea, he told the examining physician, who recorded in the senator's medical record. Last year he ran for re-election and had a particularly fatiguing campaign in which a great deal of vilification was hurled at him. The attack on him affected him and caused him much mental anguish. His symptoms increased more than ever from this time on. In the last few months there has been an increased amount of activity in the Senate. He felt that he would be unable to continue his present pace. But back to work he went, the pressures on him only growing, his pace easing not at all, as increasingly the investigations seemed to cast a shadow on the White House. He refused to equivocate, and people began taking notice as they had not before. In August, while speaking in the Senate, he was pressed by Senator Vandenberg to admit that the president was culpable. In other words, said Vandenberg, a leading Republican, the senator is now saying that the chief bottleneck which the defense program confronts is the lack of adequate organization and coordination in the administration of defense. Who is responsible for that situation? There is only one place where the responsibility can be put, Truman answered. Where is that? The White House? Yes, sir. I thank the senator. With others on the committee, senators and staff investigators, he traveled the length of the country, mostly by plane. They would put down at a city or military base, go through their routine for a day or so, and then be off again, like a road show, everybody by now knowing just what to do. War plants were inspected, hearings held in local hotels. In some places they found nothing out of line. They were in Memphis and Dallas in late August, then on to San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and Spokane. Bess was kept posted nearly every day, by letter or phone call, often by both, no matter how grueling his schedule. Some letters spoke candidly of what they were finding. Biltmore Hotel, Los Angeles, California, Thursday, August 21st, 1941. Dear Bess, well, I spent yesterday at San Diego. The Navy sent a big transport plane for us. We left the airport at 9 a.m., arrived at San Diego at 10, and Admiral Blakely took us in charge for the usual show-around. Looked at Marine barracks under construction and had lunch with the recruits. A Missouri boy from St. Louis waited on me. One from New York took care of Meade, and one from Washington, Walgren. Looked over the new Marine base camp and then got another walk around a plane plant, the Consolidated, said to be the biggest of them all. The managers are all such liars you can't tell anything about the facts. Each one says he's having no trouble and everything is rosy, but that the other fellow is in one awful fix. By questioning 5 or 6 of them separately, I've got an inkling of the picture, and it's rather discouraging in some particulars, but good in others. We are turning out a very large number of planes, and could turn out more if the Navy and Army boys could make up their minds just what they want. Labor is a problem. The same brand of racketeer is getting his hand in, as did in the camp construction program. Some of them should be in jail. Hold some hearings today and tomorrow, spend Saturday and Sunday in San Francisco, and open in Seattle Monday. Kiss Margie. Love to you, Harry. Flying in and out of Washington's new national airport, he looked down on the tremendous gouge in the mudflats along the Virginia side of the Potomac, downstream from Arlington Cemetery. It was the site of a gigantic new 5-sided headquarters for the military, the Pentagon, a larger office building than any in the world, and a clear sign of the direction the country was taking. From modest beginnings and in only a few months, the committee proved its value, producing both results and attention. By fall, its appropriation was increased from $15,000 to $50,000, its membership enlarged by one more Democrat, Harley Kilgore of West Virginia, and 2 Republicans, Harold Burton of Ohio, who was to become one of the most dedicated members, and Homer Ferguson of Michigan, a former judge who, like Brewster of Maine, was to be a particularly tenacious interrogator at hearings. The staff, too, was expanded. Eventually, there would be 15 investigators and as many clerks and stenographers. Hearings were held in the committee's headquarters on the 4th floor of the Senate Office Building, room 449, or in special cases in the great marble caucus room on the 3rd floor. Frequently, business was also transacted in what was called the dog house, a small room behind Truman's office with a few worn leather chairs, refrigerator, whiskey, and walls covered with Civil War scenes and photographs and cartoons telling the chairman's political life story. At Truman's insistence, any member of the Senate was welcome to sit in and take part in the hearings. When presiding, he seemed invariably well prepared and in charge, yet he seldom dominated. Instead, he would go out of his way to let other senators hold the stage. No one could remember congressional hearings being handled with such straightforwardness and intelligence. As in his earlier railroad investigations, witnesses were shown every courtesy, given more than ample time to present their case. There was no browbeating of witnesses, no unseemly outbursts tolerated on the part of anybody. One reporter wrote of a studious avoidance of dramatics, no hurling of insults or threats of personal violence that characterize so many other congressional hearings. Yet Truman could be tough, persistent, in a way that took many observers by surprise. It was a side of the man they had not known. Columnist Drew Pearson wrote that one of the most remarkable developments of the committee was its chairman. Slightly built, bespectacled, a lover of Chopin, and a shunner of the limelight, Truman is one of the last men in Congress who would be considered a hard-boiled prober. In manner and appearance, he is anything but a crusader. Above all, the chairman was eminently fair. Once, during testimony from one of the dominant figures in the American labor movement, the flamboyant, pugnacious head of the United Mine Workers, John L. Lewis, Senator Ball questioned whether the witness was to be taken at his word when he said workers were going hungry. "Mr. Lewis, you are not seriously trying to tell the committee that any large number of workers in the United States don't get enough to eat. This is demagoguery, pure and simple, and you know it." Lewis, sitting forward on the edge of his chair, a dark scowl across his massive face, responded angrily in a deep stentorian voice that filled the room. "If you ask the question, I will answer it. But when you call me a demagogue before you give me a chance to reply, I hurl it back in your face, sir." Truman broke in. "Now, Mr. Lewis, we don't stand for any sassy remarks to the members of this committee," he said, "and your rights will be protected here just the same as those of everybody else. I don't like that remark to a member of the committee." "Senator, did you object when the senator called me a demagogue?" replied Lewis, a man of fierce pride. "Yes," Truman said, "it works both ways. I don't think the senator should have called you a demagogue." The documenting of waste and mismanagement in the construction of Army camps had been comparatively easy work, a way to give the committee credence in about the least time possible, which was why Truman had started with the camps. The larger work, more difficult, more time-consuming, more important, and much more risky politically, was the investigation of defense production, the gathering of facts, figures, specific detail, and no end of opinion on the building of ships and warplanes, on ordnance plants, automobile plants, labor unions, government contracts, the roles played by the giant corporations and small business, the stockpiling of vital materials. And what the committee turned up was extremely alarming. Bad planning, sloppy administration, sloppy workmanship, cheating by labor and management, critical shortages everywhere. There was too little aluminum, so vital for warplanes, too little copper, zinc, and rubber. Even after drastic cutbacks in production for civilian use, the annual output of aluminum was only about half the demand for building planes. One producer, Alcoa, the Aluminum Company of America, had a near monopoly on the manufacture of the lightweight metal and kept claiming it could supply both domestic and defense needs, yet could not come even close. Production of magnesium was even more woefully behind, and the reason, when revealed, would cause a sensation. An arrangement had been made through an interlocking cartel between Alcoa and the giant German firm of IG Farben. To safeguard its American market for aluminum, Alcoa had agreed to hold back on producing magnesium, also to sell what magnesium it owned to the Germans at a cut price, with the result that Germany had far more magnesium than the United States. Standard Oil of New Jersey, through its agreements with IG Farben, had intentionally delayed the development of synthetic rubber plants. Standard Oil, reported Truman, had agreed with the German IG Farben company that in return for Farben giving Standard Oil a monopoly in the oil industry, Standard Oil would give the Farben company complete control of patents in the chemical field, including rubber. Thus, when certain American rubber manufacturers made overtures to Standard Oil Company for licenses to produce synthetic rubber, they were either refused or offered licenses on very unfavorable terms. Needless to say, IG Farben's position was dictated by the German government. There was no unpatriotic motive involved here, concluded the committee in its report. It was only big business playing the game according to the rules, with a heavy price to be borne by the entire nation. The American government, too, specifically the Office of Production Management, had been negligent in seeing the need for a greatly increased output of copper, lead, and zinc. For his part, Truman worried that shortages of steel were the most serious of all. Automobile manufacturers had been allowed to do as they wished, which was to keep turning out cars as usual in 1941, on the grounds, they said, that only 10% of their equipment could be used for war production anyway. Automobile production for the first 8 months of 1941 actually exceeded production during the same months in 1940 and consumed quantities of strategic materials, some 18% of the nation's available steel, 80% of available rubber. The aircraft program was dawdling because the Army and the Navy had left it largely to the manufacturers to decide what planes to build. There was no planned or coordinated program for the production of aircraft, Truman would report. The committee uncovered negligence and willful misconduct in the Navy Bureau of Ships. When Admiral S.M. Robinson, chief of the Bureau of Ships, said he believed the efficiency of private and Navy shipyards to be about the same, but told the committee that comparisons were difficult because of different bookkeeping systems, the committee declared that, in a matter of such importance, the Navy should take steps to ascertain the actual facts. With private shipbuilders, the Navy was found to be extremely liberal. A representative of the Todd Shipyards Corporation, in testimony about one contract with the Navy, said that if it weren't for taxes, the company could not have handled its profits with a steam shovel. By late October, the German army had advanced to within 70 miles of Moscow, and Roosevelt offered Stalin $1 billion worth of supplies. The root of most troubles and delays, the committee concluded, was the Office of Production Management, the president's own ungainly creation, where there were two heads instead of one, William S. Knudsen, formerly of General Motors, and labor leader Sidney Hillman, founder of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. Roosevelt wanted the power divided. He had no wish to create a so-called production czar, which the committee decided was exactly what was needed most, a strong man with clear authority. This was the conclusion of the committee's first annual report being prepared in the final months of 1941. Truman in particular had been outraged to discover Hillman withholding a construction contract from a low bidder because of his fear of trouble from irresponsible elements in the American Federation of Labor. First of all, Truman told the Senate on October 29th, the United States does not fear trouble from any source. If Mr. Hillman cannot or will not protect the interests of the United States, I am in favor of replacing him with someone who can and will. The record of the OPM, said the report, was not impressive. Its leadership was inept. Its mistakes of commission have been legion, and its mistakes of omission have been even greater. It has all too often done nothing when it should have realized that problems cannot be avoided by refusing to admit that they exist. The committee had also decided it would be best for the country and for the defense effort to dispense as soon as possible with all $1-a-year men, of whom there were more than 250 in the Office of Production Management. Such corporate executives in high official roles were too inclined to make decisions for the benefit of their corporations. They have their own business at heart, Truman remarked. The report called them lobbyists in a very real sense, because their presence inevitably meant favoritism, human nature being what it is. They should be paid government salaries in keeping with other government positions of comparable responsibility, concluded the committee, and required to disassociate themselves from any other employment or any payment from companies with defense contracts. Divided loyalties, like the divided command at the top of the Office of Production Management, were a bad idea. On October 30th, the American destroyer Reuben James was attacked and sunk by a German U-boat off the coast of Iceland, with a loss of 115 men. Talk of war had become commonplace in Washington, though no one seemed to be doing anything very specific about it. Writing in his diary on December 2nd during a stop in the city, David Lilienthal, head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, said it looked as if a war with Japan, not Germany, was only days off. Yet people seemed unconcerned. He wondered if the democratic system was capable of coping with the world as it was. On December 4th, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox declared, "No matter what happens, the U.S. Navy is not going to be caught napping." Having no wish to embarrass the administration and thereby harm the defense effort, Truman saw that the president received an advance copy of the committee's findings, and in an 11th-hour decision before the report was released, Roosevelt disbanded the OPM and announced the establishment of an all-new War Production Board under a single head, Donald M. Nelson of Sears Roebuck. Others had been pressing Roosevelt to make the change, including Secretary of War Stimson, but for the Truman Committee it was a signal victory. "We have fought to get you this job," Truman would tell Nelson later. "We are going to fight to support you now in carrying it out." But by then the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and it was Nelson's task to mobilize for all-out war. By then, even the likes of Burton K. Wheeler were saying that the only thing left to do was beat the hell out of them. Truman had been in Missouri the first week in December, busy with political chores. The night of December 6th, he checked into a hotel in Columbia, hoping to catch up on some greatly needed sleep. How he heard the news the next day and managed to get back to Washington in time for Roosevelt's momentous address to Congress on December 8th, he recounted a week later in a letter to Ethel Noland, probably because he had always seen her as the one in the family with the greatest feeling for history. December 14th, 1941. Dear Ethel, well, at last I am sitting at my desk. The office is empty for the first time since I returned. One reason is the doors are locked and it's Sunday. I came down to clean off my desk and find out just how many important letters were covered up on it. Do you remember that picture with W.C. Fields as the efficiency filing expert? Well, my desk is just like his was. Whenever the girls can't find a letter in the files, they are morally certain it's lost on my desk, and the pitiful part about it is sometimes it's true. Well, there's been a lot of happenings since I was calling on you on my daddy's birthday, December 5th. I've been afraid it would come, but not just the way it did. We're always surprised, of course, even when the expected happens, if it's war anyway. I left Saturday for Columbia to get a good night's sleep over the weekend before Monday at Jeff City. In fact, I was hoping for 2. Went to bed at the Pennant Hotel outside of town about 7 o'clock Saturday night and had breakfast Sunday at 8. Called the madam and went back to bed. The boy who drove me down left about noon and at 3 o'clock called me from Cross Timbers, I bet you never heard of it, and told me that the Japs had bombed Honolulu. The boy was a deputy U.S. Marshal and he was on his way to Springfield. Well, I phoned the St. Louis office of TWA and told him I had to be in Washington the next morning, and about that time Bess called and said the Secretary of the Senate had called to say there'd be a joint session Monday and that I should be there. Well, I had no car and no driver, so I called the little airport at Columbia right across the road from the hotel, and the manager said he had a plane and would take me to St. Louis. We left at 4:50, and I was on the ground and in the station of the St. Louis airport at 5:35. It took us just 40 minutes to fly 130 miles. Then my trouble began. I tried to go to Chicago and then tried Memphis, and finally I think TWA dumped somebody off and I got on the 11 p.m. plane for Pittsburgh. Sat up all night and listened to the radio, got to Pittsburgh at 3:30 where I met Senator Chavez of New Mexico, who came from Chicago, Senator Davis of Pennsylvania, who lives there, and Curly Brooks, the great Republican isolationist from Chicago. He's a new senator from Illinois, Legionnaire, fat, curly-haired, has a small synthetic blonde wife, and is a most important Chicago Tribune senator. He looked as if he'd swallowed a hot stove, and that's the way all those anti-preparedness boys looked the next day. It wasn't because they'd been up all night getting there, either. I went home. We got here at 5:30 a.m., found Bess up getting breakfast. My new secretary, Harry Vaughn, was at the airport with my car, and I was at home by 6 o'clock. Went to bed and slept until 10, and then came to the Senate. It was quite an occasion. Guess you heard it on the radio. Then on the 11th, we had to accept another invitation from Germany and Italy. Goodness knows where it will end. I wish I was 30 and in command of a battery. It would be a lot easier. 2. Harry Truman was one of the liveliest, most vital senators in my time, wrote a veteran Senate employee, the liaison for the press, Richard Rydell, who had first come to work as a Senate page at the age of 10 in 1918. Rydell had observed them all from the days of Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr., and doubted that any had ever enjoyed public life as much as Truman, or took it so in stride. An easygoing joviality emanated from him. He had an interest in everything and everyone. But often at the hearings of his committee, Truman seemed to present a different face to the world. When he got down to business, the twinkle in his eyes would be replaced by a look of concentration. At such times, at close range, the thick lenses of his glasses gave his eyes a fearsome, eerie stare, so stern that it gave the weird illusion that one was confronting an entirely different person. At such times, said Rydell, he was grateful Senator Truman was his friend. In the frenzied, confusing weeks after Pearl Harbor, the Undersecretary of War, Robert Patterson, had urged the President to do away with the committee, saying it would impair our activity if we have to take time out to supply the Truman Committee all the information it desires. But Roosevelt had no such wish, and as the work of the committee continued, the energy and effectiveness of its chairman drew increasing attention. The first annual report was presented to the Senate on January 15, 1942. In time would come 50 additional reports as a consequence of extensive, careful research and more than 400 hearings at which 1,798 witnesses appeared. Amazingly, all reports of the committee were to be unanimous. Asked how this could happen, Republican Owen Brewster said it was not hard to get men to agree when the facts were known. Early 1942 was a dark time. Singapore fell to the Japanese, then Bataan. With the surrender of General Wainwright and some 75,000 American and Filipino troops, the largest surrender of an American fighting force since Appomattox. Leningrad was still under siege after more than 6 months, and along the eastern seaboard of the United States, offshores long thought safe from Europe's wars, German U-boats were sinking oil tankers almost at will. And so close, wrote Eric Sevareid, that a chorus girl in a Miami penthouse could see men die in flaming oil. Washington made ready for air raids. Best Truman had blackout curtains on order for the Connecticut Avenue apartment. The senator took his World War I helmet to the office and at night would lie awake tossing and turning, fighting the war. In April, driving through North Carolina on committee business, he tried to think only of spring returning, the return of Ceres from Pluto's palace. The dogwood and apple orchards were in bloom along the winding road, and at the hotel at Chapel Hill all was quiet and restful. Still he couldn't sleep, fretting over the course of the war. In a speech on the Senate floor that summer of 1942, he called for a second front in Europe to relieve the Russians, as a matter of clear military necessity. In a speech at home in Jackson County, he said the war was only a tragic continuation of the one we fought in 1917 and 1918. The victors in that war, he argued, had the opportunity to compel a peace that would protect us from war for many generations, but they missed the opportunity. A spirit of isolationism had brought the worst calamity of the present conflict. It must never happen again. Disclosures produced by his committee were shocking. Curtiss Wright was discovered manufacturing faulty airplane engines for delivery to combat forces. One inspector for Curtiss Wright, a man with 2 nephews in the Army Air Corps, broke down and wept as he told the committee investigator what was going on. "If I were the executive in charge of a plant of that sort, I would know what was going on," Truman told an Air Corps officer who testified. "And I think it is plain negligence and maybe worse than that they didn't know. They should have known." The officer agreed. "No doubt about it," said Truman. The Air Corps had denied that there were problems. Curtiss Wright launched an advertising campaign stressing the company's contribution to winning the war. But the faulty engines were a reality, and as Truman surmised, more than negligence was involved. As an aftermath of the committee's investigation, one Air Corps general involved was sent to prison. Questioning the cause of troubles with the B-26 bomber built by the Glenn Martin Company, the committee was informed by Martin himself that the wings were not wide enough. Truman asked why the wings weren't fixed. Martin said plans were too far along and that besides he already had the contract. Truman said if that was how Martin felt, then the committee would see the contract was ended. Martin said he would correct the size of the wings. "They saw a lot of the seamy side of the war effort," Truman once remarked, speaking for the committee. Yet for Truman, the disclosures appeared to confirm many of his worst suspicions about big business in America. He was truly a Jeffersonian in spirit. William Jennings Bryan remained a political hero. The things Truman had said in the Senate in earlier years about the evils of big banks, big insurance companies, big corporations had been said in earnest. He had never really known any industrialists or heads of giant corporations, most of whom were Republicans. He had never counted such people among his personal or political friends. Nor, at this stage, does he ever appear to have accepted the view that a certain amount of corporate stupidity and corruption was inevitable in an undertaking so massive and involving so many interests as the war effort. In fact, the American industrial powerhouse, America's phenomenal productivity, was what would turn the tide against Germany and Japan. It would prove the decisive factor in the war, and Truman was to give too little credit to the vast majority of patriotic business people and industrialists who were making this happen. At times, in what he wrote and said, he made it seem as though the committee and its investigators were the only ones doing their duty. He didn't believe that, of course. Also, from what he and his investigators were finding, it was easy to understand why he might have felt as he did. A classic case and one of the most memorable days of testimony concerned the United States Steel Corporation and its subsidiary, Carnegie Illinois Steel. At issue was the quality of steel plate being produced for ships. As frequently happened, the committee's first hint of trouble came in letters from employees who felt it their patriotic duty to report what was going on. At first, little was done. The volume of similar complaints and warnings from around the country had become too great to handle. Much of it was obviously crank mail, and to follow every lead would have been impossible. But when a newly launched ship, a tanker called Schenectady, built by Henry J. Kaiser, broke in two at Portland, Oregon in January 1943, the question of steel plate became one of vital importance. At the Carnegie, Illinois rolling mill at Irwin, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, investigators for the Truman Committee found that at least 5% of the plant's production, or about 3,000 tons of steel per month, failed to meet Navy specifications, yet was being labeled and delivered as up to standard. The results of quality tests, chemical analysis conducted in the mill to determine the quantity of carbon and other elements in the steel, were simply altered, as were other tests for tensile strength, to conform to what the customer expected to receive, in the words of the chief specifications examiner, a man named Murray Stewart. If the chemical analysis of a heat of steel wasn't known, he said, then they would just make one up for the record book. Stewart was among the first to appear on the day of the hearing, March 23, 1943, and he provided some of the most damaging of all testimony, as well as a touch of unintended humor when Hugh Fulton encouraged him to explain how exactly the system worked. Fulton: in other words, you would make up a chemical analysis which you thought would fit what the steel should have been. Stewart: that is right. Fulton: and how would you deal with that in that particular record book? Stewart: in order to keep our records so that we would know when it was an incorrect heat number, we would enter it in this book in pencil. Fulton: how were the other entries made? Stewart: they were made in ink. Fulton: and did you, in addition to making them in pencil, put any prefix letter in front of them? Stewart: it was a common practice to put an F. Fulton: what did F mean? Stewart: fake. Fulton: you told our investigator originally that it meant phone. Stewart: that is right. Fulton: but now under oath you desire to state it meant fake. Stewart: that is correct. The investigator was a stranger to me, and I was sort of pressed for something to say at the moment. An assistant metallurgist, David B. Ireland, Jr., testified, apparently in the hope of putting the operations at Irwin in a better light, that he learned how to fake the tests at the Edgar Thomson Works, another giant Carnegie, Illinois mill near Pittsburgh. Indeed, he had become so proficient, said Ireland, that he could readily fool a Navy inspector whenever one was on hand. To date, only one tester had been caught cheating by a Navy inspector, Ireland continued, but there was an explanation for that. He cheated more than he was supposed to cheat. Was the man fired? Asked Senator Homer Ferguson. No, said Ireland, he was demoted. Was he demoted because he went too far? Chairman Truman asked a higher-ranking employee, Chief Metallurgist W.F. McGarity. Yes, sir, said McGarity. Going a little too far, he was demoted, repeated Truman. He wasn't fired, he was just demoted. And through satisfactory work elsewhere, he was brought back to a better-paying job, added McGarity. 3 investigators from the committee had gone to the Irwin Works earlier in March, or roughly 2 months after the Schenectady incident. They had called first at the Carnegie, Illinois headquarters in Pittsburgh, where they were told by the president of the corporation, J. Lester Perry, that they could speak to no employee unless a company attorney were present. Nor would they be permitted inside the mill until he, Perry, put through a call to Senator Truman to see what this was all about, a move that infuriated Senator Truman and made him immediately suspicious that Perry was trying to hide something. When the investigators arrived at Irwin about noon, they were kept waiting for half an hour, then invited to lunch at the company cafeteria. They did not want lunch, they said. They wanted to see the record book from the mill at once. But they were kept waiting another hour, and when the book was at last made available at 2 in the afternoon, they learned it had been taken apart the night before and distributed among several people who were doing work for the company attorney. 2 hours had been required to put it back together again. How much had been removed or altered they had no way of knowing, wrote one of the investigators in his report to Chairman Truman. I don't think that was exactly strong cooperation, Mr. Perry, Truman said when Perry took his place at the witness table after Stewart, Ireland, and McGarity had all completed their testimony. And I was also rather surprised that you didn't take immediate action to clean the plant and find why this procedure was followed. I want you to explain to the committee fully why that was. Senator Truman, it is not my intention to explain this and to be controversial, Perry answered smoothly. You can be as controversial as you like, said Truman. It is your privilege. He had never had any desire except to cooperate, Perry insisted. Perhaps he had not appreciated the full importance of the investigator's visit. Perhaps he should have done more. He had demonstrated goodwill, he thought. As he recalled, it was only late in the day when the seriousness of the situation became clear to him. That afternoon, late, it appeared definitely that they wanted to make an investigation, he said. We don't send investigators to plants just for fun, Truman snapped. I understand that now, replied Perry. Truman pressed him again on what action had been taken to straighten things out in the mill. Had anybody been fired? What corrections had been made? Trying first to evade the questions, Perry admitted that as yet nothing had been done. He needed time to get all the facts, the fullest implications. Truman found that unacceptable. If he had been president of the company, he said, he would have gotten to the bottom of the situation at once. You had all this information as soon as our investigators had it. It was Perry's position, as expressed in a prepared statement and in the course of testimony, that while management deplored such devious practices as had been disclosed by the committee's investigators, practices that higher management had no part in, even the substandard plates supplied by the mill were entirely suitable for their intended use. If the Navy was not getting what it ordered exactly, what it was getting was good enough for the purpose. The only explanation which can be given for the failure to carry out prescribed testing procedures is that a few individuals grew lax under the pressure of heavy production. He found the word cheat, as used in other testimony, unacceptable. He preferred misrepresentation. Most important, concerning the Schenectady, he said that failure of steel plate in the ship had not been the cause of its breakup, and even if that were the problem, the plate at the point where the break began was not a product of the Irwin Works. Of the senators present, it was Ferguson and Brewster, the two Republicans, who bore down hardest on Perry, while Fulton or Truman would move in with a question or comment from time to time. Ferguson picked up quickly on the question of where the Schenectady plate had been made. It was not made at Irwin, Perry affirmed again. Then where? Asked Ferguson. Homestead, admitted Perry. Didn't you hear the witness testify here that he was taught how to cheat down at the Homestead Works? Ferguson asked. Senator, this word cheat, have you a better one? Senator Brewster then read aloud from the report of an investigation conducted by the Bureau of Ships, stating quite plainly that a very poor quality of steel had been most directly responsible for the failure of the Schenectady. The plate was of definitely inferior quality, Brewster read on. It was so brittle it was more like cast iron than steel. Had Perry read the report? He had read parts of it, he replied. Brewster, his anger becoming more apparent, wondered how Perry might feel if he had a son going overseas in a ship made of such steel. Perry answered, Why, Senator, I don't for a moment condone poor steel, defective steel in ships, or anywhere else that has to do with the war effort. Don't worry about how I feel about the sons going over there. Truman interposed to explain that Senator Brewster had a son overseas in the war. If a customer asks you for a strength of 60,000 pounds, the breaking point on a test, Ferguson said, and you give him a product of 57,000 pounds, but you represent to him in figures that you have tested it and it did test 60,000 pounds, is that a misrepresentation of a material fact? Perry, yes, sir. Ferguson, you understand that was done up to 5% of the material furnished. Perry, that is the evidence here this morning. Ferguson, do you say that that was not selling a product to the United States government under false representations? Perry, if that was done, to that extent it would be. Ferguson, you heard the testimony. Is there any doubt in your mind that it was done? Perry, there is a doubt in my mind as to whether it was done in regard to material that was furnished to government specification and testing, where the government made the inspection or supervised the inspection. Ferguson, do you mean to say, do I understand you now to say that you don't believe the testimony of your own men here under oath? Perry, did they actually testify to that point, that where inspection was made by the Navy? Fulton, and also to the Navy, where they said it was possible to cheat with the Navy inspector standing right there? Perry, I have stated that where that was done, it was a misrepresentation. Ferguson, do I understand that you still insist that no inferior material was sold to the government? Perry, I still insist that it was not inferior for the end use to which it was put. Ferguson, in other words, you are the man who is stating what you think the government should buy, is that right? Perry, no, sir. Ferguson, then why don't you live up to the government specifications? Perry, we should. Ferguson, why didn't you? Perry, we will. Truman, I'll say you will. The hearing lasted 5 hours. When the company's attorney, testifying after Perry, talked of his need to master the technicalities of the steel business before justifying this situation, Truman broke in to ask what knowledge of technicalities had to do with removing cheaters from jobs of critical responsibility. I don't know anything about the steel business, Truman said, and don't expect to know about it. But I can tell you when the books have been tampered with and when there's a bunch of crookedness going on. That is plain enough for me to see. But the question of who ultimately had been responsible for what went on, of how high up the blame should go, was never really answered. No one above the chief metallurgist, McGarrity, would admit to any knowledge of rigging tests or falsifying records, nor did the hearing disclose a substantial motive for passing off the inferior steel. Those in the mill involved in the deception had nothing to gain by their actions and everything to lose if found out. The one plausible explanation offered was that it was all in an effort to set an impressive production record. In any event, management promised to set everything straight, and in the final hour, the president of U.S. Steel, Benjamin F. Fairless, promised Truman that whoever was responsible would walk the plank. "You realize, Mr. Fairless," said Senator Brewster, "how incredible it seems that subordinates in the company would risk their entire future without hope of reward of any character. That, of course, is what impresses the committee and makes it so amazing." Senator Ferguson was curious whether Mr. Fairless thought, from what he had heard during the day, that the operations of Carnegie Illinois Steel was an example of good management. "I certainly do not," said Fairless. "I consider it was very, very poor management." At the close of the hearing, asked by a reporter for his personal comment on what had been divulged during the day, Truman said he did not think that could be printed. On the issue of the $1-a-year men on the War Production Board, Truman stood fast, stressing with great feeling the essential injustice of the system, but giving in at last, much against his better judgment, because the production czar he had helped create, Donald Nelson, argued otherwise. Nelson wanted no change in the system, insisting it was the way to get maximum results from industry. He had to have people who understood how industry worked, he told the committee. Asked why such men should be allowed to retain their corporate ties and benefits, he said people with big salaries had big expenses, mortgages, insurance, and the like, and could not make the change to government pay without suffering hardship. "I don't think there should be any special class," Truman responded. Only that morning he had received a letter from a man who had been earning $25,000 a year, a reserve officer who had been called up for duty. "He's going to get $140 a month, and he can't draw his $25,000 while he is gone," Truman said. "He is satisfied to do that because he wants to win the war, just as you do and just as I do, by every means possible, no matter what it costs him, because if he doesn't win it, his $25,000 a year won't be worth a cent. I am laboring, and have been, under the delusion, maybe, that if the government had the power to take these young men away from their jobs and their outlook on life for the purpose of this emergency, the $1-a-year men could face the same situation and face it adequately and would be glad to do it." He was not opposed to the $1-a-year men because they were businessmen. He wanted more businessmen in government, especially in the war effort. But he knew how human it was for a steel executive on loan to the War Administration to hesitate in ordering any action that might injure the standing of his company or industry once the war was over. He had learned that certain high-ranking $1-a-year men had initially delayed the construction of new furnaces when they were needed because of concern over what increased ingot capacity might do to their post-war profits. But reluctantly he backed off, saying that if Nelson felt the system was what it took to win the war, then the committee should not stand in the way. In a letter to Nelson a few days later, he was more specific. The committee did not like having procurement matters entrusted to those who were such obvious hostages to fortune, he wrote. However, the committee believes that the best interests of the procurement program require that it be administered by a single head who will be able to do things in his way and who will be judged by his accomplishments as a whole. The committee will, therefore, support you even on matters in which it disagrees with you. By pushing harder on the issue, he felt the committee could run the risk of overreaching its power to the point of dictating policy, like the intrusive Civil War Committee. In backing Nelson, he was also standing by a fundamental conviction that control of the war effort must be kept in civilian hands. In just the first 6 months of 1942, military contracts added to the economy totaled $400 billion. He saw ambitious generals and admirals on all sides gaining influence over industry and agriculture, and he worried what this could mean for the future. In the fall of 1942, on a broadcast for the March of Time, he called the issue of civilian control the foremost of the day and warned it could shape the whole political and economic structure of the country after the war. "The function of generals and admirals is to fight battles," he said, "and to tell us what they need to fight battles with." General Brian Somervell, wearing 3 stars now, was again called before the committee to explain an incredible project called Canol, after Canadian oil. The scheme was to build a 4-inch oil pipeline across 1,200 miles from Canada to Alaska, and it had been launched on the nod from Somervell, secretly, with little thought to the realities of terrain, climate, available materials, available manpower, or the views of oil experts, the Corps of Engineers, and the War Production Board. An item was added to the War Department budget of $25 million with no description, except that it was for the construction of military facilities in Canada and Alaska. The shroud of secrecy had been primarily to avoid interference from other civilian sides of government, and in particular the notoriously irascible Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior and head of the Petroleum Administration. Employees of the contractor, Stephen Bechtel, began calling Canal the greatest project since the Panama Canal. But then Ickes found out about it and went before the Truman Committee to say the whole project grew entirely out of a one-page memorandum from General Somervell, who was anxious to conserve paper. Ickes called the pipeline useless, and the committee came to much the same conclusion, having heard more from Somervell's chief advisor for the project, James H. Graham, a $1-a-year man who, Ickes said, was worth every penny of it. Graham, the committee found, had no idea how long the pipeline was to be. He had made no estimate of the cost, nor did he believe anybody else had. "I didn't regard the cost in time of war," he told the committee more than once. The committee dams it up and down while the War Department is as usual scrambling desperately to save face instead of having the guts to admit a mistake frankly and go on from there, wrote a new observer on the scene, a young reporter for the United Press named Alan Drury, on the day of Somervell's appearance. All the desperate assertions of an embarrassed incompetence have been hurried forth to justify the thing, but the committee is unimpressed. Somervell had paraded into the hearings flanked by 4 brigadier generals and several majors. At one point, as Drury happily recorded in his journal, Somervell asked for some water, handing his glass to a brigadier who handed it to a major who, finding no one of lesser rank available, filled the glass himself and returned it to the brigadier, who returned it to the general. The committee hammered away at Somervell for 4.5 hours, with Hugh Fulton and Senator Harley Kilgore doing most of the questioning. The chairman listened quietly, but in winding up the day, Truman read Somervell a letter he had received from the Navy Department. A letter, he explained, written in answer to his own question whether the Navy had ever been asked for its opinion on Canal or requested to participate. According to the letter, a search of Navy files had turned up no communication indicating such an inquiry. No officers or officials of the Navy Department had ever been questioned orally about Canal. Somervell said he never implied that he had asked the Navy. "It is not a Navy situation, not any more than a bakery we might build." Truman suggested that very possibly it could have to do with the Navy, since ships burned a good deal of oil. "Yes, sir," replied Somervell, who now said the Chief of Naval Operations and others had expressed themselves in favor of the project. "The Secretary of the Navy, however, has the other opinion," said Truman. "The committee will stand adjourned." Worn down at day's end, he would complain to Bess that the pressures on him had begun to tell again. She knew of his headaches and exhaustion and worried he might push himself to the point of collapse. Witnesses at the hearings got on his nerves far more than he let on, he told her. He talked of just going away somewhere and reading Shakespeare and Plutarch over and over and over. Yet nothing about his public manner revealed any of this. He was brisk and cheerful as always. He radiated good health and youthful energy. In contrast to so many among the Congressional Brotherhood, the gray, double-chinned, food-stained veterans of Capitol Hill, he appeared abnormally fit, and his good clothes, his one indulgence, were spotless. Though not a fancy dresser, he remained too much the Midwesterner for that. He looked always, as Margaret said, as if he had just stepped from a bandbox. His suits were perfectly cleaned and pressed, his shirts immaculate. He had had a time his first few years in Washington finding a dry cleaner who could do his clothes to his satisfaction. He had dozens of suits, some old favorites, custom-made by Ted Marks, others from Eddie Jacobson's new store in Kansas City, or from Garfinkel's in Washington, mostly double-breasted, grays and blues, and cut to accentuate how trim he was. He could still get into his old Army uniform, he liked to tell people. Lately, too, he had begun wearing bow ties, a departure viewed by his wife and daughter with considerable disfavor, and there was always a fresh, perfectly folded handkerchief in the breast pocket showing 5 points, always the World War I service pin in his lapel. He looked crisp. He moved with a bounce, even in the heat of summer, his two-toned summer shoes clicking down the marble halls more rapidly than any. Richard Rydell, the young press liaison who prided himself in being able to get about the Capitol in double-quick time, remembered Truman's good-natured approval of the pace he set. One day, in a typical kidding mood, he, Truman, started in behind me and walked lockstep through the lobby to the amusement of all who saw him. His vitality seemed greater than ever, in keeping with his new confidence. He had arrived in the Senate, as everybody knew, and it agreed with him. He was having a splendid time being Senator Harry Truman of the Truman Committee. Yet he acquired no airs for all this. He was as unpresuming, as accessible as always, despite the extraordinary new power he had and the urgent wartime atmosphere of Washington. Self-importance was on display in the city in many quarters to a greater degree than ever in memory, but Truman seemed somehow unaffected. A reporter for the St. Louis Globe-Democrat described later how he had been sent by his editor to see the senator, who was reportedly back in town briefly after one of his committee forays and staying at the Jefferson Hotel on 16th Street. I went up to the front desk and asked the room clerk for the number of Senator Truman's room. He gave it to me. I went to a house phone and called the senator's room. The phone was answered not by a security guard, not by an aide, not even by a secretary. It was answered by Harry Truman. I identified myself, and he said, "Sure, come on up." I knocked on his door, and the door was opened by Senator Truman. He was alone in his shirt sleeves, with a book held closed on a finger. He put the book aside, offered me a chair, poured us each a bourbon highball, and sat back with a friendly smile. We talked without interruption for almost an hour. What we talked about, what I later wrote, I have no real recollection of. All I remember is that the book he was reading was Volume 3 of Douglas Southall Freeman's biography of Robert E. Lee, that the bourbon we drank was Old Crow, that he was completely relaxed and responsive, and that there was no one else around. Nearly everything being said about him in the papers was complimentary, and the committee and its work now had the respect of the administration. I am more surprised every day at the respect with which the special committee is regarded by people in high places, he wrote to Bess, very pleased. If I can just keep from making any real errors, we are on the way to really help win the war and to make the job more efficient and quicker. That means fewer of our young men killed and a chance for a more honorable settlement. So you must pray for me to go the right way. In the Senate, where he was always well liked, he had achieved a new stature, even among liberals who until now had regarded him as pleasant enough and conscientious, but bland. The man from Missouri, remembered Claude Pepper, had dared to say "show me" to the powerful military-industrial complex, and he had caught many people in the act. He was notable, too, for so much that he was not. He was not florid or promiscuous. He made no pretense at being superior in any regard. He did not seem to need the limelight, flattery, or a following. He did not want to be the president. To his pleasure, he was recognized now in restaurants and hotel lobbies, as he had never been before except in Missouri, and not always there. "Now you've got to help me more than ever, so I won't be a damn fool or stuffed shirt," he told Bess. Margaret, now in her late teens, had begun singing lessons and was doing splendidly, he thought. She was talking already of a singing career. Neither he nor Bess was a singer. Margaret never heard him even try to sing, which seemed odd for someone with such love for music. But he did nothing to discourage her, said only that she must first finish college. He called her Margie, or Miss Skinny. Alert and energetic, with a sunny disposition, she was one of the great satisfactions of his life. They so clearly enjoyed one another's company that it gave pleasure to others. One time, one Christmas, remembered a niece of Ethel Nolan's who lived in the Noland house on North Delaware, Margaret was with him and they came across for a little visit Christmas morning, and I don't think I ever laughed any harder. They just gave it back and forth. They were as fun as can be. Repartee! He was so crazy about Margaret, just enjoyed being with her and talking with her, and we sat there just entranced. With friends in Washington, he could talk about her by the hour, as she knew. "You have a good mind, a beautiful physique, and a possible successful future outlook. But that now is up to you," he wrote when she turned 18. "You are the mistress of your future. All your mother and dad can do is to look on, advise when asked, and hope and wish you a happy one. There will be troubles and sorrow aplenty, but there will also be happy days and hard work. From a financial standpoint, your father has not been a shining success, but he has tried to leave you something that, as Mr. Shakespeare says, cannot be stolen, an honorable reputation and a good name. You must continue that heritage and see that it is not spoiled. You are all we have, and we both count on you." Later, to Bess, he would write, "Tell my baby she has a most beautiful voice. To keep it natural, without any gimcracks, pronounce her words clearly and in English so they can be understood, and she'll be a great singer. She, too, must never become a damn fool or a stuffed shirt." They remained an extremely close-knit family, their social schedule modest, their way of life private and quiet. At home in the small, simply furnished apartment on Connecticut, Truman's corner of the living room included a chintz-covered armchair, a reading lamp, his phonograph, and his record collection. In a small freestanding bookcase within arm's reach was a leather-bound set of Plutarch's Lives, a 2-volume Andrew Jackson by Marquis James, all 4 volumes of Freeman's Lee, the Bible, stories of the great operas, a biography of John Nance Garner, and Don Quixote. Bess, now in her 50s, looked plumper and more matronly by the year and was enjoying Washington as she never had. The stepped-up pace of wartime agreed with her. He had put her on the office payroll, a not uncommon practice, but one he had criticized others for, most notably Tuck Milligan during his first Senate race. Her salary was $2,400. Truman worried about damaging publicity if ever this were known, but the extra income made a difference. How much real work she did would remain a matter of opinion among the staff, none of whom were as well paid. At one point he advised her privately to only just drop in and do some signing of letters. It helps all concerned. She was working also at the USO one day a week and reportedly reveled in the excitement he was causing on the Hill. In a letter from Independence during a visit in June of 1942, she told him how much better he was sounding on the radio. A speech explaining the rubber shortage had been broadcast nationwide. She thought it his best yet, and Ethel Noland agreed. His consonants had all been pronounced just right, Ethel said. The day before their 23rd wedding anniversary, he sent Bess 23 roses, then telephoned her that night and wrote a letter the next morning. Washington, D.C., June 28, 1942. Dear Bess, well, this is the day. Lots of water has gone over the dam. There have been some terrible days and many more nice ones. When my store went flooey and cost my friends and Frank Wallace money. When Margie came, don't think I ever spent such a day, although the pains were yours. And to name one more, when we thought Stark had won and when I lost actually for Eastern Judge. But the wins have far outweighed them. June 28, 1919 was the happiest day of my life, for I had looked forward to it for a lifetime nearly, or so it seemed. When a man gets the right kind of wife, his career is made, and I got just that. The greatest thing we have is a real young lady who hasn't an equal anywhere. That's all the excuse we need for living, and not much else matters. It was grand to say hello last night. I was so tired I could hardly sit up. Went to bed right away after playing Margie's song record and the Minuet in G and Chopin waltzes. It's pretty lonesome around here without you. Kiss Margie, lots and lots of love and happy returns. Harry. In November 1942, after the American landing in North Africa, he was praised in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in a way that would have been inconceivable a few years before. Harry Truman, wrote Marquis Childs, had become one of the most useful and at the same time one of the most forthright and fearless of the 96 in the Senate. In a book published that same fall, a brilliant portrait of Washington going to war called I Write from Washington, Childs also contrasted the appalling revelations of the Truman Committee to the kind of false picture presented by the Office of Facts and Figures, a new propaganda agency. Truman and his committee were now known nationwide, observed the Washington Star. So great was their reputation, said Business Week, that often a threat to take everything to the Truman Committee is sufficient to force a cure of abuses. The whole country was greatly indebted to Senator Truman and his colleagues, wrote The Nation. Arthur Kroc of the New York Times so admired the senator's objectivity at the total expense of partisanship in his running of the committee that he invited a select few of his fellow journalists to lunch with Senator Truman at the renowned Metropolitan Club, and wrote later of the excellent impression he made. By 1943, the committee had produced 21 reports covering a wide range of subjects: gasoline rationing, lumber, farm machinery, the loss of American shipping to U-boats. The week of March 8, 1943, Investigator Truman was on the cover of Time. In many ways, said Time, the Truman Committee was among the outstanding successes of the entire war effort. It was the watchdog, spotlight, conscience, and spark-plug to the economic war behind the lines, and a heartening sign that even in wartime a democracy could keep an eye on itself. Hardly less remarkable, said the magazine, was the transformation of Harry Truman from Pendergast errand boy to able, energetic committee chairman just when he was needed. For a congressional committee to be considered the first line of defense, especially in a nation which does not tend to admire its representatives, in Congress assembled, is encouraging to believers in democracy. So is the sudden emergence of Harry Truman, whose presence in the Senate is a queer accident of democracy. Truman himself, wrote Time, was scrupulously honest. His only vices are small-stakes poker, an occasional drink of bourbon. What do they mean, an occasional drink of bourbon? Louis Schwellenbach cabled from Spokane. In a poll of Washington correspondents conducted by Look magazine, Senator Truman would be named one of the 10 men in Washington whose services had been the most important to the war effort. Further, he was the only one on the list from either branch of Congress. On April 14, 1943, putting aside his committee work, Truman flew to Chicago to champion a cause that had little to do with the war effort and that seemed a bit surprising for a Midwestern senator, a Baptist, a Mason, and proud member of the American Legion to involve himself with. He spoke at a huge rally called to urge help for the doomed Jews of Europe. Chicago Stadium was packed, the crowd estimated at 25,000. The chairman was a prominent Roman Catholic, Federal Judge William J. Campbell. The keynote speaker was Rabbi Stephen Wise of New York, head of the American Jewish Congress. The war in which he and his comrades fought 23 years earlier, said Senator Truman in his speech, had been waged not only that nations might be free, but also that the people who make up those nations might be free. Now that freedom had been trampled to dust under the iron heel of the barbarian. The Jews of Europe, through the edict of a mad Hitler, were being herded like animals into concentration camps. It was time something was done about it. In private, Truman was a man who still, out of old habits of the mouth, could use a word like kike, or in a letter to his wife, dismiss Miami as nothing but hotels, filling stations, Hebrews, and cabins. But he spoke now from the heart, and with passing reference to Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, made an implied criticism of the president for doing too little to help the Jews. Truman was not among those who refused to believe the Germans capable of such atrocities as were being reported from Europe. Merely talking about the 4 freedoms is not enough. This is the time for action. No one can any longer doubt the horrible intentions of the Nazi beasts. We know that they plan the systematic slaughter throughout all of Europe, not only of the Jews, but of vast numbers of other innocent peoples. Now was the time for fighting, he continued, but no less important was planning for the day when the war would end. Today, not tomorrow, we must do all that is humanly possible to provide a haven and a place of safety for all those who can be grasped from the hands of the Nazi butchers. Free lands must be open to them, he said. Their present oppressors must know that they will be held directly accountable for their bloody deeds. To do all this, we must draw deeply on our traditions of aid to the oppressed and on our great national generosity. This is not a Jewish problem. It is an American problem, and we must and we will face it squarely and honorably. It was a remarkable speech, one of the strongest he ever made. How very important it was that he felt as he did, neither he nor any of his audience could possibly yet know. With other senators on the committee, Hatch, Ball, Harold Burton, Truman was giving more and more thought to problems of the post-war world. And though he played no direct part in the drafting of a Senate resolution for the establishment of a post-war international organization, a United Nations, a resolution sponsored by Senators Ball, Burton, Hatch, and Lister Hill, and hence known as B2H2, Truman was the acknowledged guiding spirit. The United States could not possibly avoid the assumption of world leadership after this war, he was quoted in the New York Times. And with Republican Congressman Walter Judd of Minnesota, who had also fought in World War I, Truman set out on a Midwest speaking tour in the summer of 1943 to spread the internationalist word under the sponsorship of the United Nations Association. He kept hammering at the same themes over and over across Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. History has bestowed on us a solemn responsibility. We failed before to give a genuine peace. We dare not fail this time. We must not repeat the blunders of the past. Not all the Truman Committee's efforts were successful. The Canal project went on and wound up costing $134 million, all money that need never have been spent, and more serious even than the financial waste was the misuse of vitally needed manpower and materials. At one point, 4,000 troops and 12,000 civilians were involved. Corporations and government agencies found to be bungling things or committing outright fraud, like Carnegie Illinois Steel, were frequently let off the hook to keep production rolling. We want aluminum, not excuses, Truman said after the committee's tangle with Alcoa. Yet overall, the committee's performance was outstanding. It would be called the most successful congressional investigative effort in American history. Later estimates were that the Truman Committee saved the country as much as $15 billion. This was almost certainly an exaggeration, no exact figure is possible, but the sum was enormous and unprecedented, and whatever the amount, it was only part of the service rendered. The most important power of the committee was its deterrent effect. Fear of investigation or public exposure by the committee was enough in itself to cause countless people in industry, government, and the military to do their jobs right, thereby, in the long run, saving thousands of lives. It was not just that the production of defective airplane engines or low-grade steel had been exposed. The committee also made positive contributions to the production of improved military equipment. The most notable, and one that saved many lives, was the famous hinge-prowed Higgins landing craft used for amphibious assault, which was built and ordered by the Navy's Bureau of Ships only after heavy prodding from the committee. With the new Higgins craft, troops could be landed on a variety of shallow beaches rather than just established harbors. It increased mobility for the offense, made obsolete much of the old coastal defenses. Yet until the committee looked at the subject with a fresh eye, Navy bureaucrats had been trying to force the adoption of a plainly inferior design. The committee was also a continuing source of information about the war effort for the whole country. In its report on the loss to U-boats, for example, the committee said 12 million tons of American shipping were destroyed in 1942, an alarming figure. This was 1 million tons more than all the nation's shipyards were then producing. The Navy immediately denied the validity of the report, but when Secretary of the Navy Knox appeared before the committee in executive session, he admitted the committee was telling the truth. Unquestionably, the relentless watchdog role, the attention to detail during the hearings, the quality as well as the quantity of the reports issued, all greatly increased public confidence in how the war was being run. Further, anyone called before the committee could count on a fair hearing. The chairman would have it no other way. From what he had observed of Chairman Truman during the day of General Somervell's testimony, Alan Drury of United Press recorded, "He seems to be a generally good man, probably deserving of his reputation." But after watching several more sessions, including one in which Truman went out of his way to keep some of the other senators from browbeating a witness, Drury could hardly say enough for the head of the committee. There are a number of times when it is quite easy to find oneself thanking whatever powers there be that the country has Harry Truman in the Senate. He is an excellent man, a fine senator and sound American. The debt the public owes him is great indeed, and Boss Pendergast put him in. Politics is funny business. 3. For quite some time, staff investigators had been picking up puzzling hints of a secret enterprise larger even than the Canal Project, odd bits and pieces of information indicating huge, unexplained expenditures for something identified only as the Manhattan Project. On June 17, 1943, Truman telephoned Secretary of War Stimson. Their conversation was brief. Stimson: "Now that's a matter which I know all about personally, and I am the only one of the group of 2 or 3 men in the whole world who know about it." Truman: "I see." Stimson: "It's part of a very important secret development." Truman: "Well, all right then." Stimson: "And I—" Truman: "I herewith see the situation, Mr. Secretary, and you won't have to say another word to me. Whenever you say that to me, that's all I want to hear." Stimson: "All right." Truman: "You are sure that this is for a specific purpose and you think it's all right. That's all I need to know." Stimson: "Not only for a specific purpose, but a unique purpose." Truman: "All right then." Stimson: "Thank you very much." Apparently, however, more information kept coming to Truman in one way or another, and by July he had been told enough to know the essential nature of the very important secret development. Incredibly, he even put it in a letter to Louis Schwellenbach, who had since left the Senate to become a federal district judge in Spokane. Schwellenbach had been concerned over sudden enormous land condemnations for the DuPont Company along the Columbia River near a desolate railroad town called Hanford. Nearly 500,000 acres were involved, and he had written to Truman to inquire about it. On July 15, 1943, Truman wrote to say he shouldn't worry. "I know something about that tremendous real estate deal," he said, "and I have been informed that it is for the construction of a plant to make a terrific explosion for a secret weapon that will be a wonder." He added, "I hope it works." This was a terrible breach of security on Truman's part, an astonishing lapse of simple good judgment, to have passed on such information in so offhand a fashion in an ordinary letter sent through the mail. It was exactly the sort of insider talk, one member of the senatorial club to another, that gave generals and admirals nightmares and little desire ever to tell politicians anything more than necessary. Truman had not bothered even to write in private, but dictated the letter to Mildred Dryden, which means that as of then she too was aware of the making of a terrific explosion. But apparently no one ever found out about the letter. Neither Schwellenbach nor Dryden said a word more on the subject as far as is known. Curiosity and concern over the DuPont operations at Hanford did not end there. Senator Elmer Thomas of Oklahoma wanted the situation investigated. He, too, apparently had been hearing stories. A staff man on the Truman Committee informed the chairman confidentially that complaints of waste and inefficiency at Hanford had become chronic, and added, In my humble opinion, I believe that this is another canal, where in the guise of secrecy is being resorted to by the War Department to cover what may be another shocking example when the lid is finally taken off. Truman felt pressured to know more, his agreement with Stimson notwithstanding. On November 30th, 1943, he informed Senator Thomas, "I have sent an investigator to look into it, and I hope we can find out what is wrong." A few weeks afterward, Fred Canfield walked into a Western Union office in Walla Walla, Washington, and sent the following telegram collect to Senator Truman. It must have made interesting reading to whoever put it on the wire. "Colonel Mathias, commanding officer DuPont plant, told me that you and the Secretary of War had an understanding that none of your committee would come into the plant. Through another agency, I found that within the last 10 days a confidential letter was received from the War Department to Army officers and to high civilian engineers, to the effect that these people were to see that no senator or anyone connected with the Senate was to be given any information about the project." Canfield, who may not have known as much as Truman about the purpose of the plant, was only doing his duty. Truman thought him overly efficient. "Whenever he finds out that I want something," he once said of Canfield, "he never stops until it is done." But after the wire from Walla Walla, committee interest in the Manhattan Project cooled. The understanding with Stimson was honored again. Nor is there anything in the record to suggest that Truman ever heard of separating plutonium from U-238, the work going on at Hanford, or had any idea how the terrific explosion was to be made. Only a few months later, Stimson, General Marshall, and Vannevar Bush, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, drove to the Capitol for a private meeting in Speaker Sam Rayburn's office. Present besides Rayburn were the House Majority and Minority leaders, John McCormick and Joe Martin. It was then, in February 1944, that Stimson and Marshall revealed the greatest secret of the war for the first and only time on the Hill. As Joe Martin wrote years later, "The United States was engaged in a crash program to develop the atomic bomb before the Germans perfected one. Marshall described the design of the bomb in some technical detail. Stimson said that if the Germans got this weapon first, they might win the war overnight. They told us that they would need an additional $1,600,000,000 to manufacture the bomb. Because of an overriding necessity for secrecy, they made the unique request that the money be provided without a trace of evidence to show how it was spent." The three legislators agreed to do what was necessary. Senator Truman was told nothing. Yet according to Stimson's diary, the chairman of the investigating committee was soon after him once more. Truman was now asking that a member of the committee staff, General Frank Lowe, be taken into Stimson's confidence about the Hanford works. Stimson by now was extremely annoyed with Senator Truman. Stimson thought he had an agreement. He told Truman no, a response Truman did not take lightly. "He threatened me with dire consequences. I told him I had to do just what I did," said Stimson in his diary, adding, "Truman is a nuisance and a pretty untrustworthy man. He talks smoothly, but he acts meanly." Under no circumstances was Senator Truman to be told anything more.